otherwise.
Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor and moderated by Professor Mike Koehler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group manages your integrity and risk profile, turning compliance into a competitive advantage. The Red Flag Group assists companies in developing and maintaining efficient and effective corporate governance and compliance programs and has a proven track record in providing integrity due diligence investigations in 194 countries.
Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and in today's episode, I'm pleased to be joined by Thomas Gorman. Tom is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Dorsey Whitney, and he focuses his practice on representing public companies and individuals in regulatory action, including corporate governance matters, accounting and auditing issues, and of course, FCPA issues and other similar matters arising under the securities laws. Prior to private practice, Tom served for 7 years at the SEC in Washington, D.C., including as senior counsel of the SEC's Division of Enforcement. And among his other writings and commentary, Tom publishes the widely read securities blog, secactions.com, which analyzes trends in securities enforcement inquiries and litigation and provides expert commentary. Thank you for joining us today, Tom.
Mike, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Today's conversation is going to mostly focus on the SEC's enforcement of the FCPA, given Tom's background and expertise. And to frame some of the issues we're going to talk about, let's just introduce, for the listeners' benefit, a recent SEC enforcement action against Las Vegas Sands, in which the company agreed to pay $9 million via an SEC administrative order. Now, proving once again that the FCPA can be a law much broader than its name suggests, while there were a few sentences in the 15-page SEC order that touched upon issues relevant to the anti-bribery provisions, the enforcement action against Las Vegas Sands was on balance a pure books and records and internal controls action, as the SEC found that Las Vegas Sands lacked supporting documentation or appropriate authorization concerning, among other things, the company's investment or involvement with a Chinese basketball team, the purchase of a building in China, a high-speed ferry service in Macau, and other aspects of its casino business in Macau as well. So I've got two questions with that background, Tom, about the Las Vegas Sands enforcement action. The first one is, what was your reaction to the enforcement action? And related to that, do you think that enforcement action was consistent with the SEC's mission of investor protection?
Sure. If you take the first question, what's my reaction to this case? I think the Las Vegas Sands case is really the poster child for the books and records and internal control provisions of the FCPA. Just take a quick look at these facts without spending a lot of time on it. Here you have a very profitable casino company based in Las Vegas, operating in Macau, that's expanding into an incredibly high-risk area of the world. And what does it do? It takes and it spends something in excess of $60 million buying a basketball team, buying part of a building, trying to start up a ferry, and in relatively short order, it turns its $62 million that belongs to its shareholders into something less than $40 million. That's a pretty good trick, since the house usually wins it when a casino's playing, but that's exactly what these guys did. And the reason that they were able to do that is because there were virtually no internal controls. The money just went out, and despite the fact they couldn't track it, despite the fact that when they tried to investigate, they were thwarted by the local Chinese brokers in China, they kept sending money. Had they had some good controls here, had somebody had to be accountable, then perhaps they wouldn't have been able to turn $60-some million into less than $40 million, and on top of that have to pay the fine. So I think this case ought to be put up in lights as saying, if you want to know why you need good controls, take a look at this. A casino that turned $60 million into less than $40 million in a short order. That says to me, you need some controls.
So I guess by virtue of that, you would be of the opinion that this enforcement action is indeed consistent with the SEC's mission of investor protection, I assume.
Oh, I think it's perfectly consistent because, you know, as you well know from the history of the statute, when you go back in time to when the statute was first created, the whole focus there was on investor protection, and it came out of the SEC's enforcement program, and the focus of it at the time when Stanley Sporkin, who was the director, was initially looking into this and then testified about creating the statute, the focus was on the executives being stewards of the shareholders' money. And stewards meant taking care of it and using it for the purpose of the investors, not for yourself, not for somebody else, not to buy casinos and buildings and things like that in China where you didn't know what you were doing. You were supposed to take care of the investors, and that's what these provisions were designed to do. When they were writing the statute, as you know, the SEC's position was that it really wanted to focus on internal controls. It wanted to focus on books and records, because if you could keep track of the money, then you could keep track of the cash that was put in there by the investors, and you could take care of them. And had the Las Vegas Sands done that, its shareholders might be a lot richer today.
Yeah, and following up on some of the points that you made there in your answer about, you know, if only there were internal controls in place. And in connection with the Las Vegas Sands enforcement action, the SEC dinged the company, among other areas, for its failure to engage in pre-hiring due diligence of certain service providers, in terms of not having original backup documentation prior to paying invoices. And the question, and those were just a couple of some of the other alleged deficiencies that the company had. My question there is, of course, looking with the benefit of hindsight, as I guess the SEC, you know, has the pleasure of doing in many cases, things become crystal clear when the perhaps better point to analyze whether a company has internal controls is when the action is actually taking place and not necessarily knowing what is going to transpire. So what do you make of, is this what I'll call sort of with the benefit of hindsight, woulda, coulda, shoulda theory of enforcement, given that we now know that some of these investments turned out bad? In other words, if these investments turned out good, would there have been, do you think, books and records and internal controls case brought?
Well, the fact that the investments turned out bad sort of highlights the fact that the internal controls are bad. And I agree with you, Mike. In any one of these cases, you're always looking back, and the enforcement people are always looking back, and they always have the benefit of hindsight. But in this case in particular, I think the controls were so bad that whether or not it's tainted by hindsight is really beside the point, because here you have millions of dollars going out to basically this Chinese broker that they hired. They obviously didn't know very much about this gentleman. When the first red flag came up, because they sent him some money and nothing was happening, they tried to investigate it. Nothing happened. They hired an accounting firm. He stopped the accounting firm violation, and then they sent him another $20 million. So the question is, how many red flags do you really have to see before you say, okay, we made a mistake? And the fact here is, had they really done the kind of investigation of this person and had the proper procedures in place, they might not have had these losses. And as you well know, this is a huge problem in a lot of these FCPA cases, because people or companies go into relatively high-risk parts of the world, like China, and those countries have a history of doing business through agents and local finders and other similar type people, and that's fine, and it's certainly fine to work with the system that's there. But before the company starts to do business with them, before the company starts to entrust them with the shareholders' money, it really needs to sit down and take a hard look at what's going on here, do some good due diligence, do some good procedures, and at least based on the way the Las Vegas Sands order is written, it appears that here there was virtually nothing done other than they got an introduction to this person and they went with him, and even when things started going bad, instead of stopping and taking stock, which would have been prudent, they kept going. So, like I said, there's always some hindsight when you're looking at a books and records kinds of case, because it's always easy to look back and say, well, if you did this or if you did that. But in this case, it appears that they did so little that you really didn't need the hindsight.
Yeah, so it's actually, perhaps a rather strong case for the SEC to bring. As you well know from your time at the SEC, in some of these enforcement actions, on one level, the SEC is addressing specific conduct and specific companies and specific deficiencies. And perhaps on another level, the SEC, through an enforcement action, is trying to, send a message to other issuers as to, SEC expectations about the books and records and internal control provisions. Do you see in this enforcement action perhaps the SEC trying to send that broader message to the issuer community, or do you perhaps to see it strictly based upon the specific facts at issue?
No, I think you're correct. Almost any of the more significant enforcement actions that the SEC does have a sort of preventative kind of message component to them, if you will. The SEC is very much aware of the fact that they can only bring so many cases. They can't go out and find everything that goes wrong, everything that might violate the federal securities laws. So they have to pick their spots, and they try to do that, and they try to bring cases that are meaningful. And when they resolve these cases, they hope that by coming up with a result like they did here, that they're telling other issuers, look, these are things that you need to think about. You need to think about how you do your due diligence. You need to think about how your internal controls are working. And when you see red flags, you need to think about what you're going to do rather than just keep going and saying, I got to get to the goal, I got to get to the target. It's like, no, stop. Remember, it's not your money. Remember, it's the shareholders' money. And I think the Las Vegas Sands case has a big component of that, as do many of their more significant cases.
Yeah, and just following that line of inquiry and the general, perhaps deterrence message that the SEC is trying to send in some of these enforcement actions. Again, as stated a few minutes ago, among the findings in the enforcement action were that Las Vegas Sands, when engaging various service providers, did not always engage in pre-hiring due diligence. And that Las Vegas Sands did not always have original backup documentation prior to paying invoices. If you're a general counsel or chief compliance officer at an issuer company, are you now supposed to internalize that and say, well, gee, my gosh, if we don't do due diligence on one of our service providers, we're in technical violation of the internal control provisions. If we don't have backup documentation prior to paying all of our invoices, gee, we're in technical, violation of the internal controls provision. Do you think that's a valid way, a legitimate way for the issuer community to view these in isolation like that, or should should those similarly situated people perhaps take a step back and realize that, yeah, that might have been an allegation, but it was an aggregation of so much more stuff?
Yeah, I think if you're a CCO and you're looking at this case, you really ought to see it more for the music than maybe the literal line-by-line statements. And the music here is, what did you know about this consultant, as they call him in the SEC's order? What did you know about this consultant before you hired him? Mm-hmm. What did you know? And what did you do to find out who he is? And it's not that you needed to have a checklist of pick a number, 5 points, and say, oh, I did 5 points, so he must be okay. It's like, who is he, and how trustworthy is he, and how good do I feel about giving him the shareholders' money? You know, if I was taking the money out of my bank account, would I feel really good about this or not? You know, what kind of controls do I have on him after he gets the money, and that will tell me that my project, whether it was buying the basketball team or it was setting up the ferry or some of the other things the Sands tried to do, how do I know that that's going to happen in a manner that I want to do business with and not end up with, as they said with the ferry business, red envelopes full of cash, translation bribes? How do I know it's not going to wind up in that kind of bailiwick? And if I'm the CEO, I want to know that, because it's my job to make sure that those things go right and that these things are done with the way the company wants to do business, taking care of the shareholders' money.
Yeah. No, I like the music analogy there, and I like the way you phrased it in terms of if this was your individual money being spent on these things, would you be comfortable with the situation before, you know, putting your money on the table? That's I think a good way to look at it. I do want to ask a couple of, I guess, bigger picture questions. If readers listeners are interested in reading more about the Las Vegas Sands enforcement action, there's, you know, discussion of it on FCPA Professor website, and I'm guessing Tom's website as well. And the two bigger picture questions that now don't necessarily specifically relate to Las Vegas Sands are about the SEC being put to, or not being put to, as the case may be, its burden of proof in FCPA enforcement actions. And then after this issue, the sort of time period it takes to resolve an FCPA enforcement action. So starting with the first big picture question, the FCPA, of course, was enacted in 1977, and before too long, we're going to be celebrating, or at least recognizing, the FCPA's 40th anniversary in short order. And during this 40 years of the FCPA, at least to my knowledge, no issuer is believed to have ever put the SEC to its burden of proof in an FCPA enforcement action, at least one that involves allegations in whole or in part regarding bribery. What do you think accounts for this? That's a pretty remarkable statistic. 40 years, one statute, never has the SEC been put to its burden of proof. What do you think accounts for this?
Well, I think that's really the nature of the charges here, Mike, because as you know, there are very few FCPA cases that have ever gone to trial to start with. Most of the ones that do go to trial involve individuals. There are a couple where companies went to trial. Usually they involve bribery charges. But typically issuers just simply don't try these cases. Most companies look at these cases, they look at the charges, and they view it, for better or for worse, they view it as a business decision. And the business decision is, can I solve, okay, I have a problem here. I have a problem with a regulator. How can I solve this and move on with my business? I can be more productive with resolving it and moving on than sitting here and spending the millions of dollars that it will probably cost me to defend this thing and tying up all of my executives for years and years and years on defending this case. So the business decision is, how do I want to spend the shareholders' money? Do I want to move forward with the business, or do I want to spend it defending what I did 5 years ago or 6 years ago? The result, unfortunately, for the development of the law is that you don't get courts who are looking at these things saying, yes, this is a control problem. No, that's not a control problem. Yeah, that's a disclosure problem. No, that's not a disclosure problem. What you get is a series of basically consent decrees like this, where the law develops by fits and starts in negotiations between defense counsel and the government. And as we all know, the government is the 800-pound gorilla, so they tend to get their way, which is really not, in my view, the best way for the law to develop. But in this particular area, that is the way it's developed.
Yeah, and you've articulated it, very well there, and no doubt have experience with this dynamic from both sides of the table, so to speak, given your time at the SEC and your role in counseling companies. And, query whether that dynamic you've just explained is indeed healthy when you have a legal system, as we do in the United States, that at least aspirationally is based upon the rule of law, rather than, as you say, perhaps just a business decision that at the end of the day amounts to risk aversion.
Well, I think that's a valid point, and in some ways I think it's unfortunate that there's no way to facilitate the litigation of these issues, so that, for example, if the company didn't agree with the interpretation of the books and records and control provisions that the SEC or the DOJ was putting out, there's no efficient way for the company to say, well, let's present this to a court, you argue, I'll argue, and we'll figure it out. Rather, you wind up with, you get charged, and then you go through discovery, and 5 years later, and several $1 million worth of the company's money, and the executives all testifying and giving depositions rather than running their departments. That's the sort of dynamic that you wind up with. If there was, it would be nice if there was a sort of shortcut method to present these issues to the court. There just doesn't seem to be in these particular cases.
And as we approach the 40th anniversary of the FCPA, and in the minds of many, the goalposts keep on moving, and there's some ever-expanding enforcement theories. One set of theories in the last year or so that I think you'll see some additional enforcement actions on in the coming months are, the internship cases and the hiring type cases, whether it's that or other expansive enforcement theories, whether as to FCPA elements per se, or perhaps whether as to other generic legal issues such as statute of limitations, or there's been some developments in terms of SEC disgorgement in recent weeks. Do you think the time has come, notwithstanding those dynamics that you well articulated, do you think the time has come for an issuer perhaps to say enough is enough and put the SEC to its burden of proof in an enforcement action? And if your answer is yes, do you think the time has come? Do you nevertheless think it will actually occur? This is a more important question.
Well, all the dynamics that you just laid out are certainly all there. I mean, if you take a look at the timeline of these cases, several years ago, one of the accounting firms I think just did a study on this several years ago. The typical FCPA case took a couple years. Now the typical FCPA case takes about 5 years. And just in the investigation stage, and then you get to the settlement, and you have all the costs that go along with that. So the cases are just going on and on and on. The law's developing, as I said before, through the tug of the government against the defense counsel and back and forth, and that's where you get the law, which is not always the best way to develop the law. But given the dynamics of this stuff and the cost, I would be surprised to see a really significant issuer do this. You may have a smaller company, that's personally run by 3 or 4 or 5 folks, where you're really dealing dealing with an individual more than the company. You might see some people like that take a couple of these cases to trial, but I would be surprised to see a major corporation take these cases to trial. It's too expensive. It's too time consuming. It just takes up too much of the corporation's assets, and frankly, these cases, or any of these cases for that matter, will take a huge drain on the company, and just in terms, not just the money, but the resources and the time and the attention that gets paid to it. And so most executives are just going to make the decision, I think, to make a deal and move on.
Yeah, and related to the time period question, just perhaps linking it back to the Las Vegas Sands case, that was in April 2016 enforcement action, and there the company's FCPA scrutiny began in late 2010. So there the time period from start to finish was about 5.5 years, and I think you mentioned this a moment ago, but in your opinion, is this too long, particularly if the SEC wants the public to have confidence in its FCPA enforcement program, and if the SEC does indeed want its enforcement actions to achieve a deterrent impact, what deterrent impact does an enforcement action have when the conduct at issue took place oftentimes 7 to 10 years prior to the enforcement action?
Well, that's a real problem, and there's probably two parts to that. I mean, one is these investigations are taking longer and longer, and they're costing more and more money. And frankly, I think some of the larger cases, I think the investigation leading up to the settlement by the company is probably costing the company more than it's paying to the government, so that by the time it gets done with the case, it's just spent this enormous amount of money and all of these resources. And in part that's the government, but you're also interestingly seeing a trend of, in a couple of the DOJ's cases, they have taken the position and said, look, we want this to be a shorter investigation. We don't want the company to do this. In the Avon case, for example, they specifically said Avon went way beyond what we asked them to do, which is a fairly unusual step. So, and part of that on the other side of that, from the issuer's point of view, is they're trying to nail down everything that they can. They're trying to get every ounce of cooperation credit that they can. And so these investigations are taking on a life of their own. They become a cottage industry. And I think that both the SEC and the DOJ, in supervising these internal investigations, which is a large part of what the FCPA investigations are, need to really take some steps to rein them in. And I think, frankly, that the defense counsel need to really sit down and with the companies, and the companies themselves need to make sure that they're reining these things in, because they're just going on too long. They're costing too much money, and it's not what this should be about. They're losing focus on both sides of the aisle, and I think that's starting to come to the fore, but more of that needs to be done. So that's sort of one piece. The second piece.
Yeah, just following up on that, perhaps before we go to the second piece, just for listeners' benefit, Tom was talking about what I call these pre-enforcement action professional fees and expenses. And he's right, in situations in which you can actually track these, and not all cases can one track them, because not all companies do disclose their pre-enforcement action professional fees and expenses. But Tom's absolutely right that oftentimes these pre-enforcement action professional fees and expenses are 3, 5, sometimes 7, sometimes 10 times greater than the actual settlement amount. And the phrase "boil the ocean" has been part of the FCPA vocabulary, I guess, for the last year or so, given Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell's statement that they're not expecting FCPA counsel to boil the ocean, which led then to, of course, a real interesting exchange, because the DOJ was pointing it at the FCPA lawyers, and then the FCPA lawyers on the blogosphere and otherwise were saying, no, it's not us. And like a lot of things, oftentimes the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But the second prong, Tom, of what we perhaps can do about these timelines.
Well, the second point, aside from everybody taking stock of what they're doing, and that means not just the prosecutors, but the defense lawyers too, and the companies. All three of those groups really need to own this process and stop boiling the ocean, to take the phrase that you just used. But the other side to this too is, and things. I think things have changed a lot over the years, and one of the things that you see today is companies are wary to self-report despite all the incentives DOJ keeps throwing out there, despite whatever the SEC says. I think they're reluctant to do that because they see themselves writing these blank checks for these processes, and they don't know where they're going to go, and they can't find themselves in the uncertainty. And a big chunk of that really goes back to the early days of the FCPA. It's trust. It's today what you see at the SEC and you see it at the DOJ is you've got this revolving door of people that go in and out of these places. The policies change with the people, the policies change with the times, and so it's hard to know where you're going and where you're going to get to, and the incentives that are offered are relatively vague, versus if you go back to the days when the FCPA was created, and you'll recall a conversation, Mike, that you and I had with Stanley Sporkham when he was creating this thing at the SEC. He created the volunteer program, and Stanley was no lightweight, as everybody knows. He was well known on Wall Street, and he was feared in corporate suites. But he set up a program where 400 companies walked in with no promise of anything and made deals with him and ended their liability. And you'll recall in that conversation you and I had, I said to him, Stan, how did you make that work? And his response was, they trusted me. And that, to me, said it all. They trusted him because although he was a very fierce regulator in his own right, he also was very cognizant of the whole idea of good corporate governance, being a good steward for the shareholders' money, and doing something in a settlement that was a win-win for everybody. This is good corporate governance for your company. This is good for your shareholders. This is good policy for the government. Let's all win something and sit down and settle this case. And that feeling, I think, is what was the success of the early days of the FCPA, and I think that the regulators today really need to work at developing that. They're all fine people. They've got fine programs, but that kind of feeling is what I think makes this process work a lot better.
Yeah, I do recall that conversation with Mr. Spork, and you're absolutely right. From my perspective, I think there's wide agreement, right, that the FCPA is a fundamentally sound statute. There are some people, myself included, that believe it can be improved along the margins, but we do have a fundamentally sound statute here. But the unfortunate reality, as I think you've hit upon, is just because the FCPA is a fundamentally sound statute doesn't necessarily mean that it's always enforced in a fundamentally sound way, or that the SEC or DOJ policies are necessarily always fundamentally sound. I do think there is a lot of cynicism and eye-rolling and, well, you come on type moments when it comes to FCPA enforcement. And, that's a problem. So I thank you for taking the time to spend some time with us today and focus on these SEC issues. I like to say that the SEC's stick is a little bit less sharp than the DOJ's stick because it's a civil law enforcement agency. But as indicated in our conversation here today, there's a lot of disputed legal and public policy issues when it comes to SEC enforcement of the FCPA. So thank you, Tom, for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.